He was fired from the Kansas City Star for lacking imagination. His first animation studio, Laugh-O-Gram, went bankrupt. The rights to his breakout creation, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, were stolen from him in a ruthless contract deal. And when he pitched the world's first full-length animated feature, Hollywood laughed and called it Disney's Folly. Yet, when he died, the entire world cried. Walt Disney was not just the man who drew a mouse. He was a farm boy who transformed the grim reality of the 20th century into a world of color, hope, and impossible magic. But behind the castle and the smile was a man forged by failure, driven by perfectionism, haunted by poverty, and willing to risk everything he owned on a dream no one else could see. This is not just the story of a company. This is the story of the man behind the magic. Welcome to Walt Disney, the complete biography. If you enjoy listening audiobooks, please like this video and subscribe to EchoLib to help us keep bringing you more such audiobooks. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1, The Boy from Marceline. The first world Walt Disney ever loved was not on a movie screen. It was a dusty, sun-drenched farm in Marceline, Missouri, where the tall corn whispered secrets and every animal was a character waiting for a story. Before the fame, before the empire, before the mouse, there was just a boy, sitting beneath the drooping branches of a weeping willow he called his dreaming tree. To understand the man who would later build the happiest place on earth, you must first understand that he spent his entire adult life trying to get back to this specific place. To this specific time. But the story doesn't actually begin in the sunlight. It begins in the cold. Walter Elias Disney was born on December 5, 1901, in Chicago. It was a harsh, windy city of timber and steel. His father, Elias, was a carpenter, a stern, unyielding man who believed in two things: the Bible and the purifying power of hard labor. For the first 4 years of Walt's life, his world was gray pavements and the sharp discipline of a father who never smiled. But then, a miracle happened. Fearing the crime and corruption of the city, Elias moved the family to a 45-acre farm in the Midwest. For 4-year-old Walt, stepping off the train in Marceline was like stepping into Technicolor. Suddenly, the world had a smell. It smelled of fresh-cut hay, of apple blossoms in the spring, and the damp, earthy scent of the barn after a rainstorm. It had a sound, too. Not the screech of city traffic, but the lowing of cows, the rustle of oak leaves, and, most importantly, the rhythmic, lonesome chug of the Santa Fe Railroad cutting across the horizon. That train whistle would haunt his imagination forever. It was the sound of adventure. In Marceline, Walt wasn't just a witness to life, he was a participant. He didn't have many toys, so he made friends with the farm animals. He watched them. He studied the way the pigs fought for food, the way the field mice scurried away from the plow, the personality of the family horse. Years later, when critics would marvel at how human his animated animals seemed, they didn't realize they were looking at the memories of a 6-year-old farm boy. It was here, in this sensory paradise, that the artist was born. And it happened with a bucket of tar. One afternoon, wandering the farm with a restless energy, young Walt found a barrel of black tar used for patching the roof. To his eyes, it wasn't construction material, it was paint. He dipped a long stick into the viscous black sludge and looked for a canvas. He found one on the side of the white farmhouse. With sweeping, joyous strokes, he drew houses. He drew animals. He drew smoke spiraling into the sky. He covered the side of the house in a sticky, black mural of his own imagination. When his father Elias saw it, he didn't see art. He saw vandalism. The punishment was swift and physical. But Walt had a secret weapon, his Aunt Margaret and his mother, Flora. Flora was the warmth to Elias's cold. She was the one who, instead of scolding him for wasting paper, would smooth out wrapping paper from the grocer so he had something to draw on. And then, there was Doc Sherwood. Doc was a retired neighbor who saw something in the skinny boy with the bright eyes. He asked Walt to draw his horse, Rupert. Walt sat in the dirt, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth, sketching the lines of the horse's flank, the arch of the neck. When he finished, Doc Sherwood didn't just pat him on the head. He gave him a shiny new nickel. Walt stared at the coin. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was the realization that struck him like a lightning bolt: you can create something with your hands, and the world will value it. It was his first commission. It was the first time he realized that magic was a trade. However, even in paradise, there were shadows. Elias Disney cast a long one. He was a man who believed that playing the fiddle was sinful and that games were a waste of time. He drove Walt and his brother Roy to work the fields until their backs ached. He was a terrifying force of nature, a man who demanded perfection and offered no praise. This tension, the soft, dreamy encouragement of his mother and the harsh, demanding reality of his father, created a friction in Walt's soul. It was the friction that makes a diamond. He learned to dream, but he also learned to work until he dropped. But childhood, like a movie reel, eventually runs out. In 1910, Elias fell ill. He could no longer manage the physical demands of the crops. The farm failed. The decision was made. They had to sell everything and move back to the city. The auction was a blur of heartbreak. Walt stood by and watched strangers buy the cows he had named. He watched the farm equipment being carted away. He watched his kingdom being dismantled, piece by piece, to the sound of a gavel. The day they left Marceline was the end of Walt Disney's childhood. As the train pulled away from the station, the 11-year-old boy pressed his face against the cold glass of the window. He watched the red barn shrink into a dot. He watched the dreaming tree fade into the horizon. He watched the only peace he had ever known slip backward into the past. He didn't know it then, but he would spend the rest of his life chasing that train. Decades later, when he built a place called Disneyland, he wouldn't build a futuristic city. He would build Main Street, USA. He would rebuild the storefronts of Marceline. He would rebuild the steam train. He would try to freeze time, to create a sanctuary where the harshness of the real world, the harshness of men like his father, could never get in. The farm, his private kingdom, faded into the distance. But the boy at the window made a silent promise. If he couldn't stay in this perfect world, he would simply have to build a new one. Not just for himself, but for everyone. Chapter 2, The Paper Route and the War. The train did not take him back to Marceline. It delivered him and his family to the soot-stained brick and bustling crowds of Kansas City. For Walt Disney, the dreaming was over. Now, the grinding work began. The transition was violent. In Marceline, the night air had smelled of sweet clover and earth. In Kansas City, it tasted of coal smoke, wet garbage, and exhaust. The gentle rustle of the wind in the oak trees was replaced by the metal shriek of streetcars and the constant, dull roar of industry. The sky, once a boundless dome of blue, was now a narrow strip of gray, choked by tenements. But the true shock wasn't the scenery. It was the schedule. Elias Disney had purchased a newspaper distributorship for the Kansas City Star, and he needed workers. Free workers. At 3:30 in the morning, a time when even the night seems asleep, 9-year-old Walt was shaken awake. Imagine the cold. Not the crisp, invigorating chill of a winter morning walk, but a biting, malicious freeze that sank through thin coats and settled into the marrow. Before the sun even hinted at rising, Walt was out on the street. He carried sacks of newspapers that weighed more than he did. The routine was brutal. He would trudge through snowdrifts that reached his waist, the icy wind whipping his face until his skin felt raw. His fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the inky paper, folding and throwing, folding and throwing. Sometimes, the exhaustion was so profound that he would curl up inside the vestibule of an apartment building just to steal 5 minutes of warmth, only to wake up panicked as the sun began to rise. This went on for 6 years. Every morning. Every afternoon after school. No pay. No praise. Just the terrifying expectation of his father. In those frozen pre-dawn hours, something hardened inside the boy. The soft dreamer of Marceline was being forged into something durable. He learned that if you didn't keep moving, you froze. He learned that the job had to be done, no matter how much your body screamed to stop. Decades later, employees at his studio would marvel at his relentless pace, his inability to rest. They didn't know that his work ethic was forged in the ice of Kansas City. But a human soul cannot live on duty alone. It needs magic. And since the farm was gone, Walt found a new temple. He found the movie theater. Whenever he could scrape together a dime, often hiding it from his father, he would slip into the dark, velvet-curtained world of the local cinema. It was a religious experience. He watched the dust motes dancing in the projector's beam, transforming into light on the screen. He listened to the live piano player improvising the soundtrack of romance and danger. But mostly, he watched Charlie Chaplin. He didn't just laugh at the little tramp, he studied him. He saw how Chaplin used movement, not words, to tell a story. He saw how a character could be poor, hungry, and beaten down, yet still possess a dignity that made the world fall in love with him. While his body was in Kansas City, shivering and tired, his mind was now somewhere else. It was on that screen. He began to mimic what he saw. At Benton Grammar School, Walt wasn't the smartest student, he was often falling asleep at his desk from the morning paper route, but he was the most captivating. He memorized Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, bought a stovepipe hat, and performed for the other kids. He realized that when he performed, when he drew funny sketches on the chalkboard, the exhaustion faded. The gloom of the city receded. He was in control. But as he grew older, the friction with his father became unbearable. Elias took every penny Walt earned. The discipline turned into tyranny. Walt needed an out. In 1917, the world provided one. The Great War was raging in Europe. For a patriotic boy raised on stories of heroism, it was a call to duty. But for 16-year-old Walt Disney, it was also an escape hatch. He tried to enlist in the Navy, but he was too young. His mother, Flora, understanding his desperate need to leave the shadow of his father, forged the birth date on his application for the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. Technically, he was still a boy. But on paper, he was a man. He shipped out to France, arriving just as the armistice was signed. But the landscape he found was not the romantic Europe of his books. It was a scarred, muddy ruin. Yet, even here, amidst the wreckage of war, the artist refused to be silenced. While other soldiers drank or gambled in their downtime, Walt drew. He didn't just draw in a sketchbook. He drew on everything. He painted cartoons on the canvas flaps of the tents. He sketched caricatures of his officers for extra money. He even painted a cartoon soldier on the side of his ambulance. The war couldn't crush him. The paper route couldn't freeze him. The failure of the farm couldn't stop him. Because Walt Disney wasn't just a driver, he was an artist marking his territory on the world. He was learning that if reality is ugly, whether it's a muddy trench in France or a frozen street in Kansas City, you can draw a better one on top of it. He returned to Kansas City in 1919. He was no longer a farm boy, nor just a paper boy. He was a teenager who had outrun his father's shadow, survived a war, and carried two things home in his duffel bag: his discharge papers, and a portfolio of cartoons drawn on the canvas of conflict. He stepped off the boat with a singular focus. He was done with the cold. He was done with the mud. He was ready to build something of his own. Chapter 3, Laughograms and the Long Train Ride. Back in Kansas City, Walt Disney was done working for others. The boy who drew on an ambulance was now a young man with a plan. He wouldn't just draw cartoons, he would sell them. He landed a job at the Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio. It was unglamorous work, drawing advertisements for farm equipment and egg-laying mash. But it was here, amidst the smell of rubber cement and graphite, that a fateful handshake changed the history of entertainment. Walt met a young artist named Iwerks. If Walt Disney was the storm, charismatic, loud, bursting with a million ideas a minute, Iwerks was the anchor. Was shy, socially awkward, and barely spoke. But when he put a pen to paper, he was a wizard. He could draw faster and cleaner than anyone Walt had ever seen. They were opposites, yet they were the perfect machine, the visionary and the craftsman. Together, they felt unstoppable. Walt, intoxicated by the new medium of animation, borrowed a camera and set up shop in a garage. He started making short, satirical cartoons called Laughograms. He took old, dusty fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood and modernized them with jazz-age gags and slang. They were a hit. Local theaters played them. People laughed. And for a 20-year-old Walt, that laughter was an addictive drug. He decided to go big. He charmed local investors, raised $15,000, and incorporated his first real company, Laughogram Films. He rented an office on the second floor of the McConaughey building, bought professional equipment, and hired a staff of eager young artists, mostly his friends. The studio was a chaotic, joyful mess. It was less like a business and more like a clubhouse. They worked long hours, played pranks, and dreamed of conquering the world, fueled by coffee and youthful arrogance. Walt was the ringleader, pacing the floor, acting out scenes, convincing everyone that they were on the brink of greatness. But ambition is expensive. Walt decided to pivot. Instead of just cartoons, he wanted to mix reality with fantasy. He created Alice's Wonderland, a film where a real, live-action little girl explores an animated world. It was innovative. It was charming. It was also a trap. The production costs for Alice spiraled out of control. Walt, the eternal optimist, was spending money he didn't have, assuming the profits would arrive just in time. But the distributors were slow to pay. The cash flow dried up. The energy in the McConaughey building shifted from electric to anxious. One by one, the paychecks bounced. The laughter stopped. The staff, who loved Walt, couldn't afford to work for free. They packed up their pencils and left. Soon, the studio was empty. The descent was humiliating. Walt Disney, the president of the company, stopped eating lunch because he couldn't afford it. He slept in the office chair because he had lost his apartment. He bathed at the train station. There is a haunting image from this time that defines his resilience. Picture a dark, cavernous office, silent except for the scratching of mice in the wastebasket. There sits Walt, 21 years old, wearing a coat to keep warm because the heat has been turned off. He is eating cold beans straight from a can, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and a half-finished reel of film. He was the captain of a sunken ship. Finally, the inevitable happened. In July 1923, Laugh-O-Gram Films went bankrupt. The landlord padlocked the doors. Walt was left on the street. Most men would have given up. They would have taken a job at a factory, paid off their debts, and forgotten the foolish dream of making drawings move. Walt Disney went to the train station. He had sold his camera. He had sold his furniture. He had exactly $40 in his pocket. He bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles, first class, a final, defiant gesture of a man who refused to feel poor. He didn't own a suitcase, so he packed his few belongings into a cardboard box. Inside, he placed a few shirts, some drawing materials, and the only thing of value he had left, the reel of Alice's Wonderland. The train ride west was a suspension in time. As the Santa Fe locomotive chugged out of the Midwest, climbing through the mountains and descending toward the desert, Walt sat by the window. The rhythm of the wheels clattered a steady beat against the tracks. Click-clack. Click-clack. He watched the landscape change from the gray, flat plains of his failure to the golden, sun-baked promise of California. He was a fugitive fleeing his creditors, a boy who had disappointed his investors and his father. But as the train crossed the state line, the dread began to lift. He was leaving the cold beans and the padlocked doors behind. He was heading toward Hollywood, the city of make-believe. He touched the film canister in his cardboard suitcase. He knew he had a good idea. He knew he had the talent. He just needed a partner who could handle the money so he could handle the magic. As the train pulled into Los Angeles, Walt stepped onto the platform into the blinding California sun. The past was gone. This time, he vowed, he would not make the same mistakes. And this time, he would not work alone. He was going to find his brother, Roy. Chapter 4, A Rabbit Lost, A Mouse Found. Los Angeles, 1923. Walt Disney stood on his uncle's porch, not with a suitcase, but with a cardboard box containing his last dream. He wasn't there to ask for a handout. He was there to pitch a future to the one person he knew he could trust, his brother, Roy. Roy Disney was not a dreamer. He was a pragmatist, a steady hand in a volatile world. He was currently recovering from tuberculosis in a veterans' hospital, frail and bedridden. But when Walt burst into the room, eyes alight with plans for a new studio, Roy didn't turn him away. He offered what little money he had and his absolute loyalty. It was the most important handshake in Hollywood history. They formed the Disney Brothers studio. Their headquarters was not a gleaming tower, but their uncle's dusty garage. They built a camera stand out of scrap lumber. They punched holes in the animation paper themselves. While Walt dreamed the impossible, Roy built the foundations under those dreams. If Walt was the accelerator, pressing down hard on the future, Roy was the brakes, keeping them from flying off the cliff. Slowly, the engine began to turn. They secured a distribution deal for the Alice comedies. They hired a small staff, including a young woman named Lillian Bounds, who worked in ink and paint. She was smart, grounded, and unimpressed by Walt's bluster. Which was exactly why he fell in love with her. But by 1927, the Alice films were losing steam. The distributors wanted something new. They wanted an animal character. Walt and his head animator, the loyal Iwerks, went to work. They didn't draw a cat, there were too many cats in cartoons. They drew a rabbit. Long ears, a mischievous grin, and a lucky foot. They named him Oswald. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was an instant sensation. The money started flowing. The merchandise hit the shelves. For the first time in his life, Walt Disney felt secure. He was 26 years old, successful, and the head of a thriving studio. He felt invincible. So, in February 1928, Walt boarded a train to New York with his wife Lillian. He was going to meet his distributor, Charles Mintz. He intended to ask for a budget increase. After all, Oswald was a hit. He deserved it. He walked into Mintz's office on a chilly Manhattan morning, a smile on his face. He left with a knife in his back. Charles Mintz sat behind his desk, calm and cold. He didn't offer Walt a raise. Instead, he slid a contract across the table. It was a budget cut. A massive one. "Take it or leave it, Walt," Mintz said smoothly. When Walt threatened to leave and take his character elsewhere, Mintz dropped the hammer. "You don't own Oswald," he said. "Universal Pictures does. And you don't have a staff anymore. I've hired them all away." Walt was stunned. While he had been on the train, Mintz had secretly met with Walt's own animators and signed them to new contracts. He had stolen the character, the revenue, and the talent. The only man who hadn't betrayed him was Iwerks. Walt stood up, his face pale. He had been outmaneuvered. He was leaving that office with nothing. No rabbit. No team. No income. He was a general whose army had defected overnight. He wired a telegram to Roy back in Hollywood. It read, "Leaving tonight, stop everything, okay, stop Walt." It was the greatest lie he ever told. The train ride home to California took 3 long days. It was a funeral procession for his career. Walt sat in the sleeper car, staring at the ceiling as the wheels clattered against the tracks. Click-clack. Click-clack. The rhythm of the train. The rhythm of his anxiety. He couldn't go back to Roy empty-handed. He couldn't go back to Hollywood defeated. He needed an idea. He needed it now. He took out his sketchpad. The anger in his gut began to turn into ink. He couldn't use a rabbit. Mintz owned the rabbit. He needed something else. He thought back to the farm in Marceline. He thought back to the cold nights in the Laugh-O-Gram studio in Kansas City, where he used to feed crumbs to the field mice in his trash can. He drew a circle. Then 2 smaller circles for ears. A pear-shaped body. Skinny legs. It was a mouse. "I'll call him Mortimer," Walt said to Lillian, showing her the sketch. Lillian wrinkled her nose. "Mortimer? That sounds too depressing. Too pompous." She looked at the cheerful, round little character. "How about Mickey?" "Mickey," Walt tested the word. It was snappy. Friendly. By the time the train pulled into Los Angeles, the depression had evaporated. Walt stepped onto the platform with a bounce in his step. Charles Mintz had stolen a rabbit, but he had inadvertently forced Walt to create a legend. But they had to move fast. Back in the garage, secrecy was paramount. Walt, Roy, and Iwerks worked behind locked doors. While the defecting animators finished the Oswald cartoons, Iwerks, the fastest animator in the world, sat alone in the back room, drawing 700 drawings a day. They produced 2 silent Mickey Mouse cartoons. They were good. They were funny. But no one wanted to buy them. The movie industry was in the middle of an earthquake. The Jazz Singer had just been released. Talkies were the new obsession. Silent films were dead. Walt looked at his silent mouse. He knew that if he released Mickey as a silent cartoon, it would fail. He had to do something insane. He had to make the drawing talk. He sank everything the studio had left into a 3rd cartoon, Steamboat Willie. He didn't just add music, he synchronized it. Every crash, every whistle, every footstep had to match the beat perfectly. Roy begged him not to do it. It was too expensive. It was technically impossible. Walt did it anyway. November 18, 1928. The Colony Theater in New York City. The lights went down. The projector whirred. On the screen, a little black and white mouse stood at the wheel of a steamboat. And then, the audience heard it. Whistle. Whistle. Toot. Toot. The mouse was whistling. He was keeping time with the music. He pulled a pig's tail, and it squealed in key. He played a cow's teeth like a xylophone. The audience didn't just watch, they roared. It was electric. They were seeing a drawing, but they were hearing a living creature. The laughter rolled through the theater in waves. In 7 minutes, the world changed. Charles Mintz had taken the rabbit, believing he had crushed Walt Disney. But he had only cleared the way for the king. As the lights came up and the applause shook the walls of the Colony Theater, Walt Disney knew two things. First, he would never, ever work for someone else again. And second, it all started with a mouse. Chapter 5, Technicolor Dreams. Overnight, the world wanted more. The mouse was a sensation, and the Disney studio transformed from a garage workshop into a factory for fantasy. But for Walt, success wasn't a destination, it was a springboard. And his next leap would be in color. The years following Steamboat Willie were a blur of frenetic energy. Mickey Mouse clubs were springing up in theaters across America. Merchandise, from toothbrushes to writing tablets, was flying off shelves. The studio had to expand, hiring wave after wave of artists to feed the public's insatiable appetite for the mouse. But Walt was bored. He knew Mickey was the breadwinner, but the character was limited. Mickey had to be nice. He had to be the hero. Walt needed a sandbox where he could experiment with mood, music, and art without worrying about a plot. He called this experiment the Silly Symphonies. If Mickey was the pop song, the Silly Symphonies were the jazz improvisation. It was here that Walt made his next great gamble. In 1932, a company called Technicolor approached him with a new invention, a 3-strip camera process that could capture the full spectrum of the rainbow. Until then, color in film had been washed out, just greens and reds. This new process was vibrant, rich, and shockingly expensive. Walt looked at the test footage. He saw emerald greens, royal purples, and blazing scarlets. He was currently midway through producing a silly symphony called Flowers and Trees in black and white. Scrap it, he told his brother Roy. We're doing it over in color. Roy, the financial break, nearly had a heart attack. The film was already half finished. Remaking it would cost a fortune they didn't have. But Walt was immovable. He knew that black and white was the past. When Flowers and Trees premiered, it was like looking through a window into another world. The audience gasped. The trees didn't just move, they glowed. The fire sequence crackled with terrifying oranges and yellows. It was so revolutionary that the Academy Awards created a new category just to honor it. When Walt walked up to the podium to accept his first Oscar, he wasn't just a cartoonist anymore. He was a visionary. But visionary is a heavy title to carry. As the studio grew, so did the pressure. Walt wasn't just drawing, he was the conductor of a massive, unruly orchestra. He approved every storyboard. He acted out every character. He timed every gag. He was a perfectionist who demanded that his artists pour their souls into every frame. The studio became a pressure cooker. And the steam had nowhere to go. Walt began to change. The boyish enthusiasm hardened into a brittle irritability. He couldn't sleep. He would pace the hallways at night, chain smoking, his mind racing with deadlines and budgets. He developed a nervous tic. Constantly smoothing his mustache, over and over again. He snapped at Lillian. He snapped at Roy. He was 31 years old, and he was burning out. The crash came in late 1931. It wasn't dramatic, no explosion, no shouting match. It was a quiet, terrifying collapse. He simply couldn't get out of bed. He would cry for no reason. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a pencil. The diagnosis was swift and undeniable, a nervous breakdown. The doctor's orders were absolute, no studio. No cartoons. No phone calls. You must leave. Walt and Lillian boarded a ship for a long cruise, followed by a cross-country train trip. For weeks, the man who had built an empire on noise and motion was forced into silence. He swam in the pool. He sat on the deck, watching the ocean. He tried to learn how to be a husband again, instead of a boss. But you cannot turn off a mind like Walt Disney's. You can only redirect it. Somewhere in the quiet of that forced vacation, amidst the rhythm of the waves and the tracks, a new seed was planted. He began to think about the limitations of the cartoon shorts. 7 minutes wasn't enough time to make people feel. He wanted to make them cry. He wanted to tell a real story, with the depth and emotion of a live-action film. He turned to Lillian one evening and whispered a crazy idea. What if we made a feature, he asked. A full-length fairy tale. Like Snow White. Lillian was skeptical. Who would sit through 80 minutes of cartoons? It would hurt their eyes. It would be too expensive. It was impossible. But the seed had taken root. He returned to the Burbank studio, his health fragile but his mind burning with a single, terrifying vision. He had conquered the short cartoon. He had mastered sound and color. Now, he was going to bet his company, his reputation, and his sanity on a film that everyone in Hollywood was already calling Disney's Folly. The risk-taker was all in. Chapter 6, Disney's Folly. He called his staff into a small, stuffy room on the studio lot. For the next 4 hours, Walt Disney did not speak to them as a boss. He performed for them as an actor, a showman, and a storyteller. He hunched over and squinted to become the wicked queen. He puffed out his cheeks to play happy. He tripped over his own feet to play dopey. He even lay down on the hard floor, hands folded over his chest, to play Snow White in her death-like sleep. He acted out every scene, every gag, every heartbeat of a story no one had ever heard before. When he finally stopped, breathless and sweating, the room was silent. Then, one by one, the most hardened animators in Hollywood began to wipe their eyes. They realized they weren't just being asked to make another cartoon. They were being asked to build a cathedral. But the blueprint was impossible. Until 1934, animation was about slapstick. It was a rubber hose world where characters could be flattened by a steamroller and pop back up. Walt was asking for something else. He wanted realism. He wanted gravity. He wanted an audience to watch a drawing of a girl and feel her fear, her love, and her heartbreak for 83 minutes. The technical hurdles were staggering. To make the world feel real, they couldn't just draw on flat paper. They needed depth. Enter the multiplane camera. Imagine a towering metal rig, standing 14 feet high. It held up to 7 layers of painted glass, suspended one above the other. By moving the camera down through these layers, they could create the illusion of three-dimensional space. The camera could glide past a tree branch in the foreground, drift over a cottage in the middle ground, and gaze at a castle miles away in the background. It was a weapon against flatness. It turned a painting into a world you could walk into. But innovation burns money. The budget was originally set at $250,000. It quickly doubled. Then it tripled. Roy Disney, the man who had to sign the checks, was living in a state of perpetual terror. He watched the debt climb to a staggering $1.5 million, an astronomical sum in the middle of the Great Depression. He went to the Bank of America, hat in hand, begging for extensions. He mortgaged the studio. He mortgaged his house. He mortgaged Walt's house. "We can't meet payroll," Roy would whisper, his face pale. "We'll have to finish the picture, then," Walt would reply, lighting another cigarette. The industry smelled blood. The trade papers began to circle like sharks. They called it Disney's Folly. Who would sit through a feature-length cartoon? They sneered. The colors will hurt their eyes. The jokes will run dry. Mickey's dad is going broke. Inside the studio, the pressure was suffocating. Walt established the sweatbox. A small projection room without air conditioning where he would review the daily animation. The sessions were brutal. Walt was a tyrant of perfection. He would watch a scene that an animator had spent weeks drawing, narrow his eyes, and say, "It's not good enough. Do it again." He threw out thousands of drawings. He demanded that the animators study live actors to understand the weight of a dress or the movement of a lip. There was no good enough. There was only perfect. Finally, the gamble was called. December 21, 1937. The Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. The premiere was a spectacle of lights and limousines. The biggest stars in Hollywood, Clark Gable, Marlene Dietrich, Charlie Chaplin, walked the red carpet. They were there with skeptical smiles, ready to witness the disaster. Walt was a wreck. He couldn't sit still. He paced the lobby. He adjusted his tie. He knew that if the audience laughed at the wrong moment, the studio was dead. The lights dimmed. The projector hummed. At first, there was laughter. The dwarfs were funny. Dopey was charming. The audience relaxed. It was just a Disney cartoon, after all. But then, the tone shifted. The Queen transformed into the Witch, a sequence of genuine, Gothic horror. The theater went quiet. And then came the moment that would decide everything. Snow White bit the apple. She fell to the floor. The screen went dark, and the season changed to winter. The 7 dwarfs knelt around her glass coffin, heads bowed, tears streaming down their painted faces. In the darkness of the Carthay circle, a sound began to rise. It wasn't laughter. It was the sound of blowing noses. It was the sound of muffled sobs. Walt looked around. He saw grown men, hardened studio executives, and cynical critics wiping tears from their cheeks. They weren't looking at ink and paint anymore. They were looking at a dead girl and her grieving friends. They had forgotten it was a drawing. When the prince woke her with a kiss, the tension broke. And when the credits rolled, the theater didn't just clap. They erupted. The audience stood up. They cheered until the walls shook. Clark Gable and Carole Lombard were seen weeping. The skeptics were on their feet, applauding the man they had mocked. Tone shift, triumphant, resonant. The next morning, the headlines didn't mention a Folly. Variety magazine ran a banner headline. Disney's Snow White, all-time box office champ. The film made $8 million in its first release, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. It paid off every debt. It built the massive new studio in Burbank. It secured the future of the company for decades. But the money wasn't the victory. On that night in December, animation ceased to be a novelty act. It became an art form. Walt Disney had not just made a successful film, he had changed the currency of imagination. The laughter of Steamboat Willie had paved the way, but the tears in the Carthay Circle Theater built the kingdom. The risk-taker had won his biggest bet. And now, anything seemed possible. Chapter 7, The Golden Age and the Rebellion. The Burbank studio was a palace built from fairy tale gold. With the millions earned from Snow White, Walt Disney designed a sprawling, 51-acre creative campus. It had air conditioning, a commissary, a gymnasium, and state-of-the-art animation buildings designed to capture the perfect northern light. It was meant to be a utopia, a workers' paradise, where artists could create without distraction. But for the hundreds of men and women who moved in, the new studio felt less like a workshop and more like a factory. The intimacy of the old, ratty buildings was gone. The departments were segregated. The king was in his castle on the top floor, and the drawbridge was slowly rising. Yet, inside this fortress, the artists were performing miracles. Flush with confidence, Walt didn't just double down, he went all in. He launched production on 3 monumental films simultaneously. Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi. Pinocchio was an obsession with perfection. Walt demanded that the animation look three-dimensional even without the special camera. Artists spent months studying the movement of real clocks to animate Geppetto's workshop. They studied the physics of water for the terrifying whale chase with Monstro. It was, and perhaps remains, the most technically flawless animated film ever made. Then there was Fantasia. If Pinocchio was a story, Fantasia was a hallucination. Walt wanted to see music and hear pictures. He collaborated with the conductor Leopold Stokowski to visualize classical masterpieces, dinosaurs dying to Stravinsky, hippos dancing to Ponchielli. He even forced theaters to install a massive, expensive new sound system called Fantasound. It was art for art's sake, with a price tag that made Roy Disney weep. And Bambi? Bambi was a study in patience. Walt brought live deer into the studio lot so animators could study their muscles. He demanded they abandon the rubbery style of Mickey Mouse for hyperrealism. He wanted the audience to smell the forest. But while Walt was building his artistic empire, the real world was falling apart. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. World War II began. The impact on Disney was catastrophic. Europe accounted for nearly half of the studio's revenue. Overnight, the markets in England, France, and Germany vanished. The steady stream of gold turned into a trickle. Pinocchio was released in 1940 to rave reviews, but empty coffers. It lost money. Fantasia, released later that year, was a financial disaster. The studio was hemorrhaging cash, just as the bills for the extravagant new building came due. The pressure cooker in Burbank began to hiss. Inside the studio, the one big happy family myth was shattering. The pay structure was a mess. Some top animators were making $300 a week, while assistant animators, working just as hard, were making $12. The ink and paint girls, who worked until their eyes blurred, were paid barely enough to cover rent. Walt, consumed by his art and the terrifying financial landscape, didn't see the resentment boiling. Or perhaps he chose not to look. He felt he had given them a palace to work in. What more did they want? But the workers wanted fairness. They wanted a union. The leader of the rebellion was Art Babbitt, one of Walt's highest-paid animators and the creator of Goofy. Babbitt didn't need the money, but he hated the inequality. He rallied the lower-paid staff. The tension grew thick. Lines were drawn between Walt's loyalists and the Unionists. The explosion came in May 1941. Walt fired Art Babbitt. The next morning, the inconceivable happened. Walt drove his Packard up to the studio gates, ready for work, and found them blocked. Hundreds of his own artists, men he had hired, men he had joked with, men he had taught, were marching in a picket line. They carried signs that read "Disney Unfair" and "One Genius, 500 Guinea Pigs." Walt was devastated. He didn't see this as a labor dispute, he saw it as a personal betrayal. These were his boys. How could they do this to him after everything he had built for them? As he drove through the jeering crowd, a part of Walt Disney hardened. He grabbed a megaphone and shouted back at them. In a moment of bitter heartbreak, he was heard muttering to a loyalist, "Let them starve." The strike lasted for 5 long, hot weeks. It tore the studio apart. Friendships ended. The cafeteria became a battleground. The magic was replaced by malice. Finally, under pressure from the government and his bankers, Walt agreed to arbitration. But he couldn't bear to be there to watch the surrender. He accepted a goodwill tour to South America, fleeing the country to film dancing parrots and llamas, leaving Roy to sign the union contracts. When Walt returned, the strike was over. The workers had won. But the studio had lost something that could never be renegotiated. The Golden Age was over. In 1940 and 1941, the Disney studio released Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and eventually Bambi. Films that stand today as the Mount Rushmore of animation. They were the pinnacle of the art form Walt had pioneered. Yet, as the last frames of Bambi were painted, the studio that made them was wounded, divided, and financially bleeding. The father figure was gone, replaced by the boss. Walt stopped roaming the hallways. He stopped learning every new hire's name. The war abroad had stolen his profits. The war at home had stolen his faith. The fairy tale was finished. Now, he had to survive the reality. Chapter 8, The War Years and the Package Era. In December 1941, the studio that had once drawn singing brooms and flying elephants was given a new assignment: illustrate the proper way to clean and assemble a .30 caliber machine gun. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army marched into Burbank. 500 soldiers moved onto the lot. They parked trucks on the manicured lawns and set up anti-aircraft guns on the soundstages. For the duration of the war, Walt Disney's Dream Factory became a defense plant. It was a surreal transformation. The animators who had spent years studying the delicate movements of a fawn's legs were now studying the mechanics of flush riveting and aerodynamics. They produced training films for the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. They drew diagrams of torpedoes. They animated maps of invasion routes. And they made propaganda. Walt turned his characters into soldiers. In Der Führer's face, Donald Duck is trapped in a nightmare, forced to screw caps onto artillery shells in a Nazi factory while saluting pictures of Hitler. It was frantic, loud, and aggressively patriotic. It even won an Oscar. But there was a darker side, too. Films like Education for Death showed how the Nazi regime brainwashed children. It was grim, terrifying work. The fantasy was gone, the studio was now in the business of reality. Walt, however, found a way to escape. The U.S. government, worried about Nazi influence in South America, asked Walt to go on a goodwill tour. They wanted him to charm the continent. Walt jumped at the chance. He took a team of his favorite artists and fled the soldiers, the strikes, and the accountants. They traveled to Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. They drank with gauchos, sketched llamas in the Andes, and danced the samba. The result was 2 films, Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros. They were colorful, chaotic travelogues. A mix of live-action footage and psychedelic animation. For Walt, it was a brief return to the fun of creation. But it was a vacation, not a vision. When the war finally ended in 1945, the studio expected to return to normal. But normal was gone. The foreign markets were still shattered. The studio was millions of dollars in debt. Roy Disney looked at the books and delivered the hard truth: they could not afford to make another Pinocchio. they couldn't even afford a Dumbo. Thus began the package era. To survive, the studio stopped making feature stories and started making anthologies. They took whatever scraps of ideas they had, a short about a singing whale, a sequence about baseball, a tone poem about trees, and stitched them together into feature-length films. They had titles like Make Mine Music, Melody Time, and Fun and Fancy Free. They were competent. They were colorful. But they were soulless. They felt like products on an assembly line, designed to keep the lights on and the animators employed. The audiences could feel the shift. They went to the theaters, but they didn't weep. They didn't cheer. They watched, ate their popcorn, and went home. The magic had been replaced by a formula. And Walt checked out. He began to drift away from the animation department. He stopped attending the grueling story meetings. He stopped acting out the characters. The man who had micromanaged every blink of Snow White's eyes now seemed bored by his own creations. He spent hours in his office, staring out the window. He became obsessed with hobbies. He started building a miniature steam train in his backyard, spending his weekends laying track and tinkering with the engine, wearing a conductor's cap. He was looking for control. He was looking for a world he could touch. The studio was adrift. They were surviving on re-releases of Snow White and commercial work for companies like Firestone Tires. They were a factory for hire, a shadow of the artistic powerhouse that had stunned the world just a decade earlier. There was one last flicker of the old flame in 1949, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. It had energy. It had character. The Headless Horseman sequence was terrifying and beautiful, a reminder of what the studio could do when it tried. But it was a relic, a final echo of the Golden Age. By the end of the decade, the war was won, but the peace felt hollow. The Disney studio was a veteran itself, weary, pragmatic, and living on past glories. Walt, now pushing 50, would pace the empty halls of the animation building late at night, the silence broken only by the whir of a film projector. The artists who remained were skilled, but the dream was deferred. He had saved his company from the brink, yet again. But to what end? For the first time in his life, Walt Disney couldn't see the road ahead. He needed a new map. And he would find it not in a fairy tale, but in a fairy godmother, a pirate ship, and a box with a glass screen. Chapter 9, The Comeback. The ledger books didn't lie. By 1949, the Disney studio was running on fumes. The package era had kept the lights on, but it hadn't filled the bank account. The studio was millions in debt, and the public was losing interest. Roy Disney, the man who carried the weight of the numbers, called a meeting and presented the brutal math. They had enough money for one last shot. They would pour every remaining resource, every ounce of credit, and every prayer into a single, classic animated feature. If it failed, the animation department, the very heart of the company, would be shuttered forever. The film was Cinderella. But Walt Disney, approaching his 50th birthday, wasn't the same man who had bet the farm on Snow White. He was older, sharper, and more strategic. He knew that relying on a single basket, no matter how golden, was suicide. So, while the artists sharpened their pencils for one last stand, Walt was secretly preparing two other bets that would change the company forever. Inside the animation building, the atmosphere was thick with anxiety. The artists knew the stakes. This wasn't just a movie, it was a fight for their survival. Walt demanded a return to the glory of Snow White, but he didn't have a Snow White budget. He ordered a ruthless efficiency. They couldn't afford to experiment. They filmed the entire movie in live action first, using actors on empty soundstages, and then the animators traced the movements to save time and money. It was less romantic than the old days, but it was necessary. Yet, even in this constrained environment, magic happened. The scene where the fairy godmother transforms the tattered rags into a silver ball gown became Walt's favorite piece of animation he ever produced. It was a symbol of what the studio was trying to do. Take the rags of the war years and transform them, one last time, into something sparkling. While the animators labored over glass slippers, Walt was looking across the Atlantic. He had unlocked a stash of frozen funds, profits earned in England during the war that couldn't be moved to the US due to currency laws. He decided to use that money to do something he had threatened for years, make a movie without a single drawing in it. He chose Treasure Island. For the first time, Disney wasn't about cute animals. It was about pirates, pistols, and blood. Filming on location in the UK, Walt discovered a new kind of thrill. Live action was faster than animation. It was visceral. And in Robert Newton's performance as Long John Silver, Walt found a character just as iconic as any cartoon villain. He was proving that the name Disney could mean adventure, not just fairy tales. But the biggest gamble was the one that terrified Hollywood the most. Television. By 1950, television was the enemy. Movie studios were terrified of the glowing box in the living room that gave away entertainment for free. They refused to work with it. They forbade their stars from appearing on it. Walt Disney saw it differently. He didn't see a thief, he saw a megaphone. He had a secret project brewing in the back of his mind, a massive amusement park that no bank would fund. He realized that television was the key. He approached the struggling ABC network with a radical proposition: I will give you a weekly show produced by Disney, and I will host it myself. In exchange, you will help me finance my park. The other studio heads thought he was crazy. Walt was giving away his content. But Walt knew what he was doing. He wasn't just making a TV show, he was creating the world's longest commercial. In 1950, the bets paid off. All of them. Cinderella opened in theaters and became a massive, runaway hit. It earned $4 million instantly, pulling the studio out of debt and saving the animation department. The gamble had worked. The magic was back. Then, Treasure Island premiered. It was a box office smash, proving that Disney could dominate the live-action market too. And finally, on Christmas Day 1950, Walt appeared on television. By 1954, his weekly anthology show, simply titled Disneyland, premiered. Families across America gathered in their living rooms to watch Uncle Walt introduce cartoons, nature documentaries, and updates on his California project. He had bypassed the critics. He had bypassed the theater owners. He was now speaking directly to the American people, in their own homes, every single week. In 3 short years, Walt Disney had executed a stunning triple play. Cinderella saved his past. Treasure Island expanded his present. And television secured his future. The weary veteran of the package era was gone. In his place stood a diversified media emperor, his eyes fixed on a tract of orange groves in Anaheim, where a new kind of dream was finally, physically, taking shape. The comeback was complete. The visionary was building. Chapter 10, The Happiest Place on Earth. The most revolutionary idea in entertainment began with a tired father on a park bench. Every Saturday in the 1940s, Walt Disney would take his 2 young daughters, Diane and Sharon, to the carousel in Griffith Park. And every Saturday, he would sit on that same peeling, green bench, growing more frustrated. The park was dirty. Peanut shells crunched underfoot. The ride operators were rude and unshaven. The horses were chipped. But worst of all, the parents were bored. They sat on the sidelines, checking their watches, detached from their children's joy. As he watched his girls circle round and round, a thought formed, a nagging, persistent itch in the back of his mind. There has to be something better, he thought. A place where a parent and a child could have fun together. That simple wish would cost him 5 years, his health, and $17 million. Walt started small. In fact, he started in his own backyard. He had always loved trains, so he built a miniature steam railroad that circled his house in Holmby Hills. He called it the Carrollwood Pacific. But this wasn't a toy. It was a prototype. He dug tunnels, built trestles, and wrote a strict rulebook for operations. He would dress in a conductor's cap and overalls, shoveling coal into the tiny firebox, blowing the whistle with a look of pure ecstasy. He realized that when he was on that train, he wasn't a movie mogul. He was transported. He was in control. He wanted to take that feeling and scale it up. He wanted to build a kingdom. When he pitched the idea to his brother, Roy was horrified. "Walt," Roy said, "amusement parks are dirty places. They're run by carnies. They smell. And they're dying." The bankers agreed. They laughed him out of the room. "You want to build a castle in the middle of orange groves? You want to charge admission to a place with no roller coasters?" It was financial suicide. But Walt was possessed. When the studio refused to fund it, he formed his own private company, WED Enterprises. He sold his vacation home. He mortgaged his life insurance. He begged. He borrowed. Finally, in a desperate masterstroke, he turned to television. He struck a deal with the ABC network. "I'll give you a hit TV show, and you give me the money to build my dream. He bought 160 acres of orange trees in Anaheim, California, a sleepy town 20 miles south of Los Angeles. And in July 1954, the bulldozers arrived. They had exactly 1 year to build a world. The construction site was a symphony of chaos. The air smelled of diesel fuel, sawdust, and crushed oranges. Walt was there every day. He wasn't in a suit, he was in slacks and a loose shirt, pacing the dirt. He was a maniac for detail. He knelt down to check the sight lines from a child's perspective. He demanded that the buildings on Main Street be built at a specific scale, smaller on the top floors, to make the castle look taller. He planted trees to block out the real world. He wanted total immersion. "I don't want the public to see the world they live in while they're in the park," he barked. "I want them to feel they are in another world." The deadline loomed like a storm cloud. Money ran out. Tempers flared. A strike by the local plumbers' union forced a terrible choice: finish the water fountains or finish the bathrooms. "People can drink Pepsi," Walt snapped, "but they can't pee in the street. Finish the bathrooms." Finally, the day arrived. July 17, 1955. They called it Black Sunday. It was meant to be an invitation-only press preview, broadcast live to the nation. It turned into a televised disaster. First, there was the heat. It was 101 degrees in Anaheim. Then, the crowd. Walt had invited 11,000 people. But counterfeit tickets had flooded the market. Over 28,000 people stormed the gates. They climbed over fences. They jammed the turnstiles. Inside, the park was melting. The asphalt on Main Street had been poured just hours before. In the searing heat, it turned to goo. Women's high heels sank into the black tar, trapping them like flies. Because of the plumber's strike, the drinking fountains were dry. Guests, fainting from the heat, accused Disney of trying to force them to buy soda, which soon ran out. In Fantasyland, a gas leak forced the area to close. In Frontierland, a boat overloaded with guests sank into the muddy water. On camera, Walt was smiling, hosting the world with Art Linkletter and Ronald Reagan. But behind the eyes, he was terrified. He was watching his masterpiece crumble in real time. The press declared it a nightmare. "Walt's dream is a nightmare," the headlines screamed. But Walt Disney didn't quit. He went to work. He stayed in the park, sleeping in a small apartment he had built above the fire station on Main Street. He walked the park in his bathrobe at night, making notes. He fixed the asphalt. He fixed the fountains. He trained the staff to be cast members, not employees. And a miracle happened. The people came back. They ignored the bad reviews. They drove their station wagons from Ohio and Kansas and New York. They walked down Main Street, USA, and they gasped. It wasn't a carnival. It was a movie you could walk through. It was clean, obsessively clean. It was safe. The smell of popcorn and vanilla wafted through the air. The band played ragtime. At the end of the street, the Sleeping Beauty castle stood pink and blue against the sky, a promise that magic was real. In its first 10 weeks, over 1 million guests walked through the gates. Walt had proven them all wrong. The bankers, the critics, even his brother. He had invented the theme park. He had created a physical sanctuary for optimism. Late at night, Walt would often stand at the window of his apartment above the fire station, looking out at the crowds below, watching the fireworks reflect in their eyes. He had finally built the world he couldn't find on that park bench. But Walt Disney was never satisfied with finished. As he looked out at his kingdom, his mind was already drifting. He was thinking about the future. He was thinking about a vast swampland in Florida. He was thinking about a city of tomorrow. The park was done. But the visionary was just getting started. Chapter 11, The Mary Poppins Miracle. For 20 years, the name, P.L. Travers, was a recurring, frustrating entry in Walt Disney's appointment book. He had first written to the author in the 1940s, a polite fan letter about her mysterious, magical nanny. He saw something in the story that he knew would make a perfect film. But for 2 decades, her reply was a variation on the same theme: no. Mary Poppins was not for sale. She was a guardian of childhood, and P.L. Travers viewed Walt Disney not as a genius, but as a purveyor of vulgar cartoon silliness. She feared he would turn her sharp, complex nanny into a dancing Tinkerbell. But Walt Disney had built an empire on outlasting the word no. He visited her in London. He charmed. He negotiated. He promised her script approval, a power he almost never granted. Finally, in the early 1960s, needing money, Travers relented. She signed the rights over, but she arrived in Burbank with a scowl, ready to fight for the soul of her character. While Walt managed the difficult author, he handed the musical soul of the film to two young brothers, Richard and Robert Sherman. The Sherman brothers were the heartbeat of the studio in the 1960s. They worked in a small office with a piano, churning out melodies that seemed to distill pure optimism into sound. Walt loved them. He would often wander down the hall, flop onto their couch, and say simply, "Play it." He didn't mean a new song. He meant the song. Richard would sit at the piano and play a slow, melancholic waltz called "Feed the Birds." It wasn't a showstopper. It was a song about a beggar woman on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral, selling crumbs for tuppence. It was a song about the sanctity of small acts of kindness. Walt would listen, staring into the middle distance, often with a tear in his eye. "That's what it's all about," he would whisper. With the music in place, they needed the Mary. Walt found her on Broadway. Julie Andrews had just been passed over for the lead role in the film version of My Fair Lady. She was available, and she was perfect. She had a voice like crystal, crisp, precise, but warm. She could be stern enough to govern a nursery, but magical enough to jump into a chalk painting. But making the film was a battle. P.L. Travers hated the songs. She hated the script. She famously demanded that there be no color red in the film. She was horrified by the idea of animated penguins. "Mary Poppins does not dance with cartoons," she declared. Walt played the diplomat. He listened to her objections, nodded sympathetically, and then went ahead and made the movie he wanted to make. He knew that Travers understood the book, but he understood the audience. He pushed his technical team to the limit. The Jolly Holiday sequence, where live actors danced with animated farm animals, was a technical marvel. It required a seamless fusion of two worlds, the very thing Travers hated, but the very thing that gave the film its joy. Finally, the work was done. August 27, 1964. The world premiere at Grauman's Chinese Theater. The lights went down. The opening chords of the overture swelled. For 2 hours and 19 minutes, the audience was spellbound. They laughed at the spoonful of sugar. They tapped their feet to step in time. They watched a fractured family heal itself through magic. P.L. Travers sat in the audience, weeping. Some say she cried because she felt her book had been butchered, others say she was overwhelmed by the emotion of the screen. But the most important reaction that night came from Walt Disney. He sat in the dark, watching the screen. And for the first and only time at one of his own premieres, the staff saw tears streaming down his face. Why did Mary Poppins break the man who rarely showed emotion? Perhaps it was the song, "Feed the Birds." Perhaps it was the sheer beauty of the production. But many believe it was the story of Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks is a cold, distant father consumed by his work at the bank. He demands order. He doesn't know how to play with his children. By the end of the film, he learns to let go. He repairs the kite. He takes his children to the park. He becomes the father he needs to be. In Mr. Banks, Walt may have seen a reflection of his own life, the workaholic who missed dinners, the man who built an empire but worried he had missed the childhood of his own daughters. In the dark of the theater, watching Mr. Banks skip down the street, Walt Disney saw the redemption he had always wanted. Mary Poppins was more than a hit, it was a validation. It earned 13 Academy Award nominations and 5 wins, including Best Actress for Julie Andrews. It was the crowning achievement of his filmmaking career, a perfect alchemy of song, story, and spectacle. But the true trophy was the tear he wiped away in the dark. He had won over his most skeptical critic, he had created a new classic, and in the story of a nanny who made everything right, he had found a way to bring order and wonder to a messy world. With the nanny's job done, Walt could now turn his full attention to his final, most audacious project. It wasn't a story to watch, but a city to live in. The Florida swampland was waiting. Chapter 12, The Florida Project. To the world, Walt Disney in 1965 was the smiling host on TV, the beloved Uncle Walt, who had built the happiest place on earth. But in a private boardroom in Burbank, he was orchestrating one of the largest and most secretive land grabs in American history. He wasn't just planning another park. He was planning to build the future itself, and he was running out of time. Disneyland had been a triumph, but for Walt, it was also a source of frustration. He hated the cheap motels and neon signs that had sprung up around the perimeter of his park in Anaheim. He felt hemmed in. He wanted control. He wanted a canvas so large that the outside world couldn't touch the edges. He set his sights on Central Florida, a vast, humid expanse of cattle pastures and mosquito-infested swampland near Orlando. The operation was worthy of a spy novel. If word got out that Disney was buying land, prices would skyrocket. So, Walt and Roy set up dummy corporations with nondescript names like Latin American Development and Management Corp. And Redlaw Enterprises, Walter, spelled backward. Through these shell companies, they quietly bought plot after plot. They bought cow pastures. They bought swamp. They bought hunting leases. By the time the press caught wind of what was happening, Disney owned 27,400 acres, an area twice the size of Manhattan. In November 1965, the secret was out. Walt and Roy held a press conference in Orlando. Standing next to the governor of Florida, Walt dazzled the reporters. He promised them a Disney World, a bigger, better version of Disneyland with a magic kingdom and hotels. But the reporters missed the gleam in his eye. They thought he was talking about rides. Walt was talking about a city. He called it EPCOT, the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. This was Walt's true obsession. He had grown bored with fiction. He wanted to fix reality. He looked at the American cities of the 1960s and saw decay, traffic, and crime. He believed he could design a solution. EPCOT wasn't going to be a theme park. It was going to be a functioning, living city of 20,000 residents. It would have no slums, because Disney would own the land and no one would be unemployed. It would have no traffic jams, because cars would be banished to underground tunnels, while residents traveled on monorails and people movers. It would be a laboratory for American industry, a place where new technologies were tested in real time. It will be a community of tomorrow that will never be completed, Walt told the cameras, his voice thick with passion. It will always be introducing and testing and demonstrating new materials and systems. He wasn't building a ride, he was attempting to build a civilization. But as the blueprints for the city of tomorrow expanded, the architect was fading. Walt Disney had been a chain smoker since World War I. His voice, once smooth, was now raspy and prone to coughing fits. He suffered from chronic pain in his neck and back, which he dismissed as an old polo injury. In November 1966, just a year after announcing the Florida project, Walt went to the hospital for what he thought was routine neck surgery. The doctors took an X-ray. They found a tumor the size of a walnut on his left lung. The diagnosis was lung cancer. It was advanced. They removed the lung immediately, but the prognosis was grim. The man who had spent his life defying the odds was finally facing an antagonist he couldn't outwork. Yet, the mind refused to surrender. There is a heartbreaking, iconic image from these final weeks. Walt was lying in a bed at St. Joseph's Hospital, his body frail and failing. His brother Roy sat by his side. Walt couldn't get up to show Roy the plans, so he stared at the ceiling. He used the square acoustic tiles of the hospital's ceiling as a grid map of Florida. "Roy," he rasped, pointing a shaking finger upward. "This tile is the highway. That tile over there, that's the entrance complex. And here." He pointed to a spot in the center of the white ceiling. "Here is the city. Here is EPCOT." He spoke in the present tense. He described the monorail routes, the industrial parks, the layout of the residential zones. He was directing his final movie on the blank canvas of a hospital ceiling. He made Roy promise to build it. In December 1966, Walt Disney walked the studio lot for the last time. He was gaunt, his suit hanging loosely on his frame, but his eyes still held that familiar, determined light. He reviewed plans for the Florida property, giving instructions to his designers as if the groundbreaking were next week. He shook hands. He drove home. The greatest dreamer of his age had drawn his final blueprint. Now, he had to entrust its construction to others. Chapter 13, Goodbye, Walt. The final act was not played on a stage. It took place in a sunlit bedroom of a quiet home on Carrollwood Drive. In late November 1966, Walt Disney came home from the hospital for the last time. The frantic energy of the studio, the roar of bulldozers in Florida, the chatter of TV crews, all of it faded into a distant hum. Here, there was only the soft voice of his wife Lillian, the visits from his daughters, and the view of his backyard railroad, now still. He was weak, but his mind was still racing, still tinkering, still planning. He spoke of the future with a certainty that frightened and comforted those around him. He didn't say, if the city would be built, he said, when. But the body has limits that the imagination does not. On the morning of December 15, 1966, at St. Joseph's Hospital, the circulatory system of the world's greatest showman collapsed. Walt Disney was gone. He was 65 years old. He had asked for no public funeral. There was no state procession, no open casket. Just a small, private ceremony at Forest Lawn Cemetery for his immediate family. The man who belonged to the world wanted his final moment to belong only to them. But the world could not be kept away. When the news broke, a hush fell over the globe. In London, flags were lowered to half-mast. In Washington, the House of Representatives paused in silence. Commentator Eric Sevareid said simply, he probably did more to heal, or at least to soothe, a troubled human spirit than all the psychiatrists in the world. A light had gone out. The 20th century had lost its wizard. But in the Burbank boardroom, there was no time for mourning. There was panic. The company was in the middle of the largest construction project in history. Without Walt, the vision was just a stack of blueprints. The bankers wavered. The executives argued. Who could possibly finish what Walt Disney had started? The answer came from the one man who had been there since the beginning. Roy Disney was 73 years old. He was tired. He had been looking forward to retirement, to fishing, to resting after 40 years of managing his brother's whirlwinds. But when Walt died, Roy put his retirement plans in a drawer. He stood before the board and the staff, grief etched into his face, and made a vow. We are going to finish it, he said. We are going to build Disney World. For the next 5 years, Roy Disney drove himself into the ground. He oversaw the draining of the Florida swamps. He supervised the construction of the hotels and the Magic Kingdom. He fought the bankers one last time. And he made one critical change. The project had always been called simply Disney World. But Roy issued a memo. From now on, the official name would be Walt Disney World. I want every person who walks through those gates, Roy said, to know that this was Walt's dream. It was Walt's world. On October 1, 1971, Roy stood on a podium in front of the Cinderella castle. He was frail, his voice trembling. He looked out at the crowds, at the gleaming spires, at the realization of the impossible. He dedicated the park to his brother. We know you would have been proud, Walt, he whispered. He had fulfilled his promise. Just 2 months later, exhausted and content, Roy Disney died. The brothers who had started with a few dollars in a garage had finished the journey together. But what of the great dream? What of EPCOT? Without the visionary to fight for it, the city of tomorrow never happened. The company felt it was too risky to run a real municipality. Instead, a decade later, they built EPCOT Center, a permanent World's Fair of technology and culture. It is a place of wonder, yes. But it is a theme park, not the utopian community Walt had drawn on the hospital ceiling. Some see this as a compromise. Others see it as the only way the dream could survive the dreamer. It remains the great what-if of his legacy, the final frontier he never got to cross. Yet, as we look back on the life of Walter Elias Disney, we don't measure him by the buildings he didn't build. We measure him by the barriers he broke. He was the farm boy who turned a bucket of tar into art on a barn wall. He was the young artist who sketched a mouse on a train ride of defeat. He was the gambler who bet his reputation on a fairy tale and made the world cry for a drawing. He was the father who sat on a dirty park bench and imagined a kingdom. His greatest creation was not Mickey Mouse. It was not Snow White. It was not Disneyland. His greatest creation was a shift in the human consciousness. He taught the modern world that optimism, innocence, and wonder were not childish things to be outgrown, but essential nutrients for the human spirit. He validated the imagination as a serious, world-changing force. He left behind a world that, in so many ways, he had drawn for us. And if you listen closely, in the whistle of a steam train, in the burst of a firework over a castle, or in the shared smile of a parent and a child, you can still hear him saying, "It was all started by a mouse." And the dream is still not finished. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the extraordinary life of Walt Disney. I'd love to know what you thought. Did his story inspire you, or surprise you? Let me know in the comments below, and tell me whose biography you want to hear next. If you're ready for the story of another legend who defined the 20th century, click the video on your screen right now to listen to the detailed biography of the King of Pop, Michael Jackson. See you there.